school in Indiana, and they don't have daylight savings there, and it was fantastic just for it to always, be not always the same time, but to avoid the resetting of your clocks twice a year. I really liked that. All right. Well, let's get right into it. Today we've got some interesting stuff to talk about, but before we get into incremental rate of return, I just wanted to remind you that your next homework assignment is due a week from today. And then simultaneous to that, you should also be thinking about the project. And remember, the project begins with an assessment of what kind of job you want to do when you graduate from school and what kind of a salary you might earn. So trying to figure out your starting income and then how that could change over time with cost of living adjustments. And so you're going to need to also be doing a little bit of outside research to support that planning, where you try and figure out what's a typical raise that people get on an annual basis. The cost of living adjustments oftentimes match the rate of inflation. So if prices of goods and services are going up, you hope that your boss and your company will increase your pay to match those increases in prices. So all of that is just to say I hope you're thinking about the project, and if you have questions as you read through that assignment description, feel free to reach out because I'd love to talk to you about it. All right, so today we're going to talk about a special kind of analysis where we're comparing alternatives with rate of return analysis. So this is I've already talked about how the external rate of return is one of the more difficult concepts in the semester. So that's one. External rate of return is one of the more difficult things. There's another thing called economic service life analysis that we'll do in a few weeks. And then incremental analysis is the third. The three mountain peaks that you have to climb over to get through this course. Today is a second of those three. All right, so just to turn back again to the project, you should be thinking about how your income is going to start and then how it changes over time. And sometimes students ask me in past semesters how specific they need to get with expenses. And what I'd say it's not okay to do is just to set a budget of some nice round number. Just to pick numbers out of the air and say, well, I will spend $500 a month on rent and $100 on utilities. That depth of detail isn't adequate for a project that represents 15% of your course grade. Instead, what you ought to do is go and find the actual renting price for a particular apartment that you would be happy to move into in the city that you expect to work. And then go into the detail of what are the utilities that you would have to pay at that apartment. And think specifically about all of the different ways that you have to pay for electricity and water and sewer and cable and so on. So if you go into a grocery store and you come up with a cost estimate on a weekly basis, and you find the actual amounts that you might spend on things on a weekly basis, and then you'd multiply that by on average 4 weeks in a month, and then 52 weeks in a year. And so you could find out your expenses by going one level deeper than just saying a certain amount on food. I want to know specifically what are you spending those amounts on. And if I see a round number like I'm going to spend $150 on insurance, what that tells me is that probably you didn't get a specific quote. Yeah, this particular person's a drinker. All right. Now, let's talk about incremental analysis. Increment means the difference between two things. If something is incrementally better, it means it's better in comparison to something else. And so incremental analysis means that you're comparing differences between two options. And so here we have two alternatives, an option A and an option B. Now what you'll notice is that option B is more expensive than option A. The first cost to acquire this item B, whatever it is $60,000 in comparison to $40,000 for option A. So B is more expensive, and it looks like the way that it justifies that added expense up front is that then the annual operation costs are lower. So option A costs $25,000 a year to operate, whereas option B only costs $19,000 per year to operate. And then when these two things are used up, they both have some salvage value, and B is more valuable when it's put out to salvage. So in incremental analysis, what we do is we compare the two. And so if we say B minus A, we could generate an incremental cash flow. That's looking at the difference in cost, as well as upfront cost, that is, as well as the difference in operating costs on an annual basis. And so in comparing B to A, it's $20,000 more expensive on a first cost basis, but then if you spend that $20,000, it's as though you were getting a revenue of $6,000 per year during the years that it's in operation. Because remember, one of the ways that we define inflow is a savings in cost that you would otherwise have to pay. And so we've talked before about the example of what if you put insulation in a warehouse and now you don't have to spend as much heating the warehouse. Well, then the amount that you would have spent on heating is considered as an inflow to you in the years after you make that investment in insulating the warehouse. And so here in this comparison, the increment is the additional cost and then the added benefit over time that hopefully will justify that added cost. And so incremental analysis is just comparing two options. And what we do is we subtract the less expensive option from the more expensive option. And so it's not coincidental the order that I've put these columns. The column on the left is the cheaper alternative. The column on the right is the more expensive alternative. And if I had 3 or 4 or 5 options, we would sort them on the left being the cheapest and increasing amount so that then the more expensive one would be furthest to the right. So our first comparison here would just be B versus A. Now, we could, if we know how long this item lasts, we could calculate a rate of return, and then we could compare the rate of return for the increment to what is considered our minimum. And that's what we'll do in this incremental analysis. We will develop an incremental cash flow, we'll find the rate of return, and compare it to the MAR. So the rate of return on this additional spending would tell you whether to do option B or option A. In decision making, you're having to pick something, a mutually exclusive alternative, and your boss or maybe even you may wonder, is it worth buying the more expensive thing? Should you spend that extra $20,000? And if you get that the rate of return on the increment is above your minimum, then that tells you, yes, buy the more expensive alternative. But if the rate of return on the increment is less than the minimum, then that tells you that the more expensive alternative is not justified. All right, so here's just an illustration of that. If you have option A and option B, we've previously done an example as an in-class exercise where we found, for instance, one of the options may have the higher present worth, whereas one of them has the higher rate of return. And so we said you should always choose the option that has the highest present worth when everything's been discounted at the MAR. So here you can see this minimum attractive rate of return has been used to calculate the present worth. And we would choose option B based on the fact that it has the higher present worth, even though it has a slightly lower internal rate of return. Remember, the warning I gave you is you can't compare projects by their IRR. But you can use the IRR on the increment between options. And so look here now at B versus A. So we subtract A from B, and we see that the incremental cost is $13,000. To get the more expensive alternative costs an extra $13,000, and then the incremental return each year is $4,225. And so if this item lasts for 4 years, then the rate of return on the increment is 11.4. And since that's greater than 10, that would tell you, yes, you should go for option B. So the incremental analysis, just looking at the difference between B and A and trying to figure out what's the rate of return on the additional amount that you would spend. Here's the decision criteria. If the IRR of the difference is greater than the MAR, then the additional investment is justified. And I guess maybe I should say if it's greater than or equal to, because the minimum attractive rate of return is itself acceptable. So we should say greater than or equal to. So this additional investment is justified. All right, now remember there's a lot of different letter I variables that we're using this semester. So let's just review those. There is capital I, meaning interest amount. There's lowercase I, means interest rate, just in general terms. But when we have I star, then that means the rate of return. So this is where we're defining it as some investment that has been made up front, and you're getting payments over time to bring down the unrecovered investment balance. And so the internal rate of return is the I star when you're assuming reinvestment. I prime is external rate of return, which we talked about last week. I sub I is one of the subcategories within external rate of return. It's the external reinvestment rate, which is that secondary location that you put the earnings for a project where it can't be reinvested. You have to put your revenue somewhere else. And if it's a secondary external account, then the rate that that external account makes is I sub I. So now finally, delta I star is the incremental rate of return. Cole, do you have a question? I thought I heard somebody with their microphone on. And it's fine if you do. In fact, I prefer it to the typed questions. I think it's more efficient if we talk directly rather than talk on chat. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to calculate delta I star. We want to find what's the rate of return on the difference between two options. All right, now here's something that a lot of students make mistakes on. And that is that when you're doing the incremental analysis, you don't know at the beginning what all of the comparisons are going to be, because some of the options may be rejected when you do the initial screening. In this case, they're all accepted. So what we've done is we've sorted them. On the left is the cheapest, and then we have the next most expensive, and then the more expensive after that, and finally on the far right column is the very most expensive option that we have. So the first step after sorting them is to calculate the internal rate of return of each option by itself, just in case we need to reject any of them from an initial screening standpoint. And if they're all acceptable, then we'll do head-to-head matchups. And the first alternative is B versus A. So we're comparing B and A. And so if you have B minus A, you can see just by inspection that it's an extra $12,000 a year to get option B. And then if you spend that extra amount up front, then you get $3,100 in additional revenue each year for 10 years. And so now if we do the IRR function, which remember is just one of those built-in financial calculations that Excel has, if you do IRR and you select this entire range, then what Excel is doing in the background is it's finding what's the interest rate that brings balance between the inflow and the outflow. So it's calculating the present worth of all of these future amounts, and it's finding out what interest rate does it take so that the present worth of the future revenue is equal in magnitude to the present worth of the initial outlay, which is already at the present. So in this case of B versus A, 22%. So if our MAR is 18, that tells us that option B is justified. It's better to get option B than to get option A, because if we can earn an 18% of return, then that's a thumbs up. But the difference between B and A is earning 22% interest. So now B is our champion, or kind of like the current winner of the matchups that we've done so far, because we compared A and B. B won. So then we compare B to C. We don't do A versus C because we've already eliminated A. We had the A to B matchup, B won. So now we take the champion of that first matchup and we compare it to the next most expensive alternative, which is option C. So now we do the C versus B matchup, and you can see that it's $5,000 more in upfront cost, $2,200 additional revenue each year. So if you do the rate of return on this difference between C and B, it's 43% rate of return. And that's greater than the MAR, so that tells us that C is better than B, because the more expensive alternative is justified if the increment is greater than the MAR. So now C is the champion in the matchups we've had so far, which includes A, B, and C. So now we do D versus C. And that is a little bit different. If you do the matchup for D versus C, D doesn't look so good. Its rate of return is 0% because you spend $5,000 and then you only get $500 each year for 10 years. And so the rate of return there is, there's no rate of return. 0% rate of return. So since that's less than the MAR, that tells you that option D should be rejected, that C is better than D. So then the final matchup is E versus C. It's not E versus D because we've already rejected D when we were comparing C and D together. And so the final analysis is E versus C, and it also has a rate of return that's less than the MAR. So that means you should reject option C because the more expensive alternative in C versus E gives us too low of a rate of return compared to the minimum. So option C is the best one through this incremental analysis. And you can double check your incremental analysis by finding the present worth of each alternative. And what you would do if you found the present worth of each alternative, you'd find that at the MAR, option C has the highest present worth. And so then that would be a secondary way of verifying which option is most attractive. So I'd say that the trickiest thing for students to do is to know what order to do the comparisons. You have to do these incremental analysis one at a time. You can't set them all up at the beginning and then do the calculations for the first one because you don't know who's going to win A versus B. So if you don't know who's going to win the first matchup of B versus A, then you can't know yet what comparison it's going to be for the second column. It could be C versus B, or it could be C versus A. So you can only do one column at a time. Now the overall principle is you should spend every additional dollar you can where you're making more than the MAR. So if 18% rate of return is acceptable, then you should always get the most expensive alternative as long as the difference between previous alternatives has a higher rate of return than the MAR. All right, so we'll practice all this with this in-class exercise for today. Now let me ask you a favor. When I give you problems like this, don't call this A, B, C, D, E. These options have names, and I've bolded the first letter in the name. And so refer to this as like option C, this is option K, this is option V. And the reason why I suggest that is just when it comes to the exam, where you'll definitely have a problem like this on the exam, it's just simpler if we all use the same variables. And so if you suddenly assign it different variables than the names that are assigned, it makes it a little bit tricky to follow the comparisons that you're doing. Okay, so with this data, and let me just bring it up as the Word file that you see. So here's what you've got in front of you. We want to compare these options and find out which one is the best with an incremental analysis. All right, so the first thing is you're going to want to do an initial screening where you compare the alternatives and you reject any of them that have an internal rate of return that's less than the MAR. So we're going to be setting up an Excel file where you're going to have the years are row by row. So fire up Excel if you haven't already. Because what you're going to want to have is up here, we'll define the interest rate, and then we'll have year, and then remember it's through, according to the problem statement here, 10-year lifespan. Okay, so you're spending some money up front at time 0, and then you've got 10 years of operation. Now, does anybody remember what order you should put these in? Because right now, the data that I've given you, it's not in any kind of order at all. Does anybody remember which column should be on the farthest to the left and which column should be on the furthest to the right? Well, let's go back to the example that we did here. Notice that it was sorted with the cheapest on the left and then the more expensive on the right. So you go from least to most. Good. So you're going to need to do that on this in-class exercise. So I've intentionally scrambled the order. You need to put the cheapest option on the left and then increasing more expensive on the right. So this is kind of the pattern that I'd like you to use for the in-class exercise today. And remember that your first matchup, which, let's see, your first matchup is going to be, well, I don't want to spoil it by telling you what the first matchup is. The first thing you have to do, though, is the IRR analysis to determine if any alternatives should be rejected. And so down here, we're going to do the IRR of each option. And so your options are going to be like Deere, Komatsu, Cat, and so on. And so down here, you'll calculate the internal rate of return for all of the options, and then you're going to reject any of them where the rate of return is less than our MAR. So our MAR is defined as 12%. So if any of them are below that, then they should be rejected. So let's see, we've got, okay, then here we're going to do like the incremental. So this is the initial screening. And then over here we'll have the incremental analysis. All right, so I don't want to reveal too much because I'd like you to think about how can you make what you've got in front of you there, how can you make this look like what we've done on this illustration. So I'll pause for a moment. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to set this up, and then I'll start talking and working through the solution. I'll narrate what I'm doing, and you can stop at that point and watch what I've done, or you can keep working if you're content and you have a good feel that you're headed in the right direction. But I'm going to give you 10 minutes just to kind of start setting things up, and I'm going to leave this illustration on the screen so that you can use it as a guide. We talked through it in quite a bit of detail, but let me pause now and give you the time. Okay, so I'm going to start typing in the data that we need to solve the in-class exercise. I'm just going to start typing it into the spreadsheet, and then I'll narrate through kind of the matchups. And Seth asks, how do you determine which of the two alternatives is the winner? And the more expensive alternative is the winner if the IRR of the increment is greater than the MAR. All right, so let me start setting it up just by filling in the data that we need, and then I'll show you, we'll talk through each of the matchups together. So deer, Komatsu, cat. Okay, so it's from cheapest to most expensive. All right, so here's just all of the raw data. And the first thing we want to do is an initial screening to see if any of them should just be rejected from the very beginning. All right, so I'm going to do the IRR for the initial screening to find out if our minimum is 12%, whether any of these should be rejected as below that, because I guess I haven't filled it in here at the top. But our minimum attractive rate of return as defined in the problem statement is 12%. So for instance, this deer option, it is 23%. And so the initial screening, the result that I have here, if I put the result of the initial screening, then it would say, okay, it's acceptable, potentially acceptable solution. Not the best solution, but it's acceptable because its rate of return is above the MAR. So deer is potentially okay. And let's do that same thing, do the IRR for Komatsu. And I don't have to keep typing that formula in over and over again. Once I've got the formula in, I can click and drag to the side like that, and it'll do the internal rate of return for all of them. So let me just double check, for instance. So here's the IRR that it's done for the cat. Here's the IRR that it's done for the Volvo, and so on. And so the Komatsu option is not okay. So we reject that because it is less than the minimum. So when we do our comparisons, our incremental comparisons, we won't even bother with the Komatsu because it's not okay. But all the other ones are okay. All right, they're all acceptable because they're greater than the MAR. Okay, so is everybody with me so far? Any questions on the setup thus far? We sorted it from cheapest on the left to most expensive on the right. We did the IRR to see if all of them were above the minimum. We rejected the one that wasn't. And now we'll begin the incremental analysis. Okay, so what's our first matchup? Our first matchup is not Komatsu versus deer because we've already rejected Komatsu. So what's our first matchup then? Cat versus deer. Good. And Travis even says C minus D. And he's right, that it's going to be the more expensive alternative minus the cheaper option. And so my first matchup, I'm going to say C minus D. That's how I'm going to just label it as the increment that I'm comparing. And so equals C caterpillar minus deer. Okay, so let's just make sure that this makes sense. All right, so it's an extra 25,700 for cat. So yes, it is the more expensive. We should expect that to be a negative value. If we had a positive value, we'd have a problem because, you know, at time zero, it's going to be an additional upfront expense. So you pay an extra 25,700. The question is, what's the rate of return on just that increment? We already know what's the overall rate of return for cat. Overall, cat has a rate of return of 17%. What we want to know is what's the rate of return on the additional amount you have to spend to get cat instead of Deere. So like if you're thinking about buying a car, you're thinking about either buying a Lexus or a Toyota. The Lexus costs more, so the question is, how much additional benefit do you get for the more expensive thing? In our case here, Cat versus Deere, the additional benefit is $4,400 in incremental revenue for each of the 10 years. Okay, so now we'll do the IRR again, equals IRR, and include the initial outlay at time 0, the revenues over time, and the rest of the range. Close that, and the rate of return on the increment is 11. Now, by the way, if I want to see the decimal, I can. I'll go up here into the ribbon and increase the percentage that it's showing. So I'll just increase decimal there. 11.2, and so let's compare this to the MAR. So what's the interpretation of Cat versus Deere? Who wins that matchup? Based on the fact that this incremental rate of return, meaning the additional amount that you spend to get the Cat, is less than the MAR, D. Right, so D is the winner. So what that means is we're going to reject Cat, keep D for now. Okay? So I'm going to wrap text on that just so it doesn't bleed into the next column. Okay. So in the matchup of the first 3 options we've considered so far, Komatsu was rejected because just it's no good overall. Cat versus Deere, Cat lost that matchup because the extra cost of $25,700 is not justified if you require 12% rate of return. It does have a rate of return, a positive rate of return, 11%, and that's great, but it's below our minimum. So Cat does not meet the criteria. So our next matchup is going to be Hitachi versus Deere. We don't need to do Hitachi versus Cat because we've already rejected Cat. We don't need to do Hitachi versus Komatsu because it was rejected in the initial screening. And so our current champion of these first 3 was Deere. So in the next matchup, it's going to be Deere versus Hitachi. So H minus D, right? So now our formula, Hitachi minus the Deere. So you have to pay an extra $33,000 to get the Hitachi equipment. And the point of that is it gives you more revenue over time, an extra $7,500 each year. That potentially sounds juicy, right? So let's find the rate of return on the increment. This is the increment. The difference between the 2 options is the increment. So the rate of return on the increment, the IRR of the increment, is 19%. So what's the interpretation then? What statement do we put down here? Like we had what was rejected and what should be kept. What's the interpretation of 19%? Reject D, keep H. That's right. Good. So the winner of the matchup is reject Deere, keep Hitachi. And again, I'll wrap that text. Maybe I should just wrap these next few columns since I'm going to be putting the same thing in. Okay. So Hitachi is our current champion. Of these first 4, Hitachi wins. Now we'll do Volvo versus Hitachi. Okay. Volvo minus Hitachi. So we pay an extra $15,000. This is not looking good because we're paying $15,000, but you're only getting $700, and you're getting 10 years of $700. So that's not even break even. there. Let's just do the rate of return to prove it. So I'm going to drag that formula sideways, and it'll do the IRR of the cells above. So a negative rate of return, which doesn't make any sense. So reject Volvo, keep Hitachi is the interpretation of that matchup. So we've so far analyzed all of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options, and our current champion of those 5 options is the Hitachi. But we've got one more comparison to do, the increment between Atlas and Hitachi. Okay, so A minus H, Atlas minus Hitachi, and I'll do Atlas minus Hitachi. Okay, and drag that down. So we spend an extra $59,000 to get the Atlas, and by doing so we get an extra $8,260 per year. So now we'll calculate the rate of return on the increment. It's very important. I keep emphasizing this word increment. It's important that you understand it means the difference between 2 options. So the rate of return on the increment, 7%, which is less than our minimum of 12. So our interpretation, reject Atlas, keep Hitachi. So our overall conclusion, the Hitachi equipment is best. It's best because we compared everything in an incremental fashion, and we found out that the Hitachi was the winner using that incremental analysis. Okay, now we have a way to double check. Just to make sure we haven't made a mistake someplace, we've solved this riddle using the incremental analysis. Now let's just double check, so verify with NPV. Because net present value, if we want to maximize our profitability, then the option that has the best NPV will be consistent with this if we've done it correctly. Okay, so equals NPV. Now, it wants an interest rate, and the interest rate that you do with NPV is the MAR. I'm anchoring that reference so that if I move the formula around, then it'll always look in that same cell for the interest rate. So I put those dollar signs in front of the B and the 1. Now, comma. Does anybody remember what is the warning about how to use the NPV function? It's a little bit different from, for example, like the IRR, where we could just highlight the entire range of data. Does anybody remember what's kind of the special restriction on NPV function? Anyone want to guess? Don't take the initial year's amount. Christian's got it exactly right. Thank you, Christian. You should only put amounts that are in the future into the NPV function. And so, it's giving us the prompt here. It wants to see value 1. It means tell me an amount, then tell me value 2, then tell me value 3. The amount we should put into it is just the amount that's in the future, because we don't need to convert this 22,000 in year 0. So I put the future amounts inside the NPV function, and then outside of the NPV function I add the amount that's already at the present. And so this 22,000 in year 0 was already at the present. So let's do that calculation for all of them. And which one is best? The one with the highest profitability is the Hitachi, and that is consistent with the conclusion we came to through the incremental analysis. So we're good. All right, well, that is all the time we have for today. Let's review our announcements. You should be working on homework 8. which includes an incremental analysis, I believe. And then you should also be thinking about the project. So that's it. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in class on Wednesday. Take care, everybody.